this is obviously complex PTSD. One quick note, hey, before you head off, we have, is it Pig in the Park? Did I do that right? Pig in the Park?
Pig in the Park.
Yeah, and we have a gathering from 5 to 7. We'll have food for you. Come see the art gallery, a chance to network, a chance to talk, and then go out and have even more fun in the park. The other things I just want to be really quick about, because I wanted to turn it over to Heather because she's the star of the show. I'm not. I'm Keith Meyer. I'm the Director of Counseling and Wellness. We have amazing programs, from counseling program all the way over to tons of peer support. If you want to ask me about any questions, you see some tables, just please, I'd be an honor to talk with you. We have a full capacity crowd here, which I love. The last thing is, I just get the absolute privilege to introduce Heather Hill. Heather's an amazing human being, number one. I think the world of her. Number two, she's an incredible mental health therapist. So one of the things that's really neat with this kind of training is someone like Heather who is really knowledgeable and has a lot of information and things of that nature, but she also has a ton of experience. Really probably into the thousands when we come up about veterans and also assisting veterans with getting benefits with certain needed documentation and things of that nature. We asked an incredible amount of our presenters to come of their talents and skills, and they do it free because they do it out of the goodness of their heart, to come to the conference and present to you. So with me done yapping, I want to turn this over to Heather Hill and just give a warm welcome.
Well, this is overwhelming. Thank you for being here. There's a wonderful crowd, and I appreciate you guys all coming to learn more about complex PTSD and all the multifaceted things that complicate treatment for working with combat veterans. Can I get a show of hands of how many veterans are in the room? Okay, wow. Thank you. That's awesome. Can I get a hooah for how many Army vets we have? How about Navy?
Yeah, go Navy!
Coast Guard? Marine Corps? There we go. How about Air Force?
Yeah.
Space Force?
We were first.
Maybe a couple years.
They're our children.
So I did a run through on this presentation with a combat veteran PTSD group that I do every other week on Mondays, and it's primarily full of Vietnam vets, and I have a handful of Iraq and Afghanistan vets that are a part of that as well. So I'm gonna tweak some of the things of how I presented based on their feedback, which I appreciated. So I do want to forewarn you folks that we will be talking about not only combat PTSD, but we're also going to be talking about childhood PTSD. Not anything in specific, but it was something that brought some feelings to the surface for them, and they wanted me to pass that along just in case there was anybody that had some sensitivity to that, so I do appreciate that. We are going to be making some distinguishing differences between civilian PTSD and combat PTSD, and that's why I have this big glob of crayons. Oh, and the other thing that I would like to ask from you, the more that you guys can participate and interact with me, the better it will be for me, and the more you're going to retain. So if you have questions, if you have comments, or if you have an anecdote that you think would complement whatever I'm talking about, please offer it, because we learn from each other the most. And I've only been able to become as knowledgeable as I am because of the veterans like you, who have been so willing to share their stories and help me understand everything to a greater depth than I would have ever on my own. I am married to a combat veteran, Army, hula hula. And we've been married for 24 years. And he has complex PTSD and obviously military-related PTSD. So this is something that's very near and dear to our family. So with that being said, what color is this crayon? Marines. What color is this crayon, Marines? There's only two of them. They're red, right? Well, this one is actually, according to Crayola, red. And this one, according to Crayola, is razzmatazz. But if you look at the spectrum of reds, there are a vast spectrum of the color red in this clump, but they're all red at the bottom line of it. And that's what I want you to remember when we're talking about the differences in PTSD, right? PTSD trauma is trauma. The symptoms of trauma are the symptoms of trauma, but they all impact us a little bit differently, and that's why we're going to be highlighting some of those differences between combat veterans and civilians. So, who is brave enough to tell me what they believe the definition of PTSD to be? Anybody? No problem. So, you have to witness, experience, or be exposed to what? Life trauma? What? I saw a squirrel get hit by a car.
Could be.
Could be to some people.
Yeah.
But by the definition of the the APA, and the American Psychological Association, it has to be life-threatening or perceived life-threatening, right? And one thing that I do want you guys to also keep in mind when we're talking about deployments, because working with vets, I've also encountered the whole, if they didn't go outside the wire, there's no way they have PTSD.
Yeah.
So I'm out of Wenatchee, Washington, and I'm pretty sure all of you folks are out of Washington as well. Have any of you guys ever experienced rocket attacks at home? Incoming mortars, anybody?
Yeah.
No. At your house?
No,
I was like, honey, we should talk. What did you say, Yakima? Well, maybe. That's fair. Maybe that wasn't the best analogy. But the other thing that I want you to keep in mind, just because perhaps another veteran didn't go outside the wire, that doesn't mean that they didn't get exposed to something that was life-transforming, life-threatening, and also caused them to be concerned about their own safety and well-being, right? If it's different than their baseline of Washington State, where we rarely have rocket attacks and mortar incoming unless it's Yakima, apparently. It is something that is a stark contrast to day-to-day life. So you have the other thing that we're going to be talking about today, and there's so many other topics that I could be telling you or sharing with you about that that also complicate PTSD, but traumatic brain injury is another one that we're going to be overviewing, as well as the adrenal system, which is your fight or flight system. And then we're going to get into the childhood trauma aspect, the percentages of military personnel who have been exposed to childhood trauma prior to ever even enlisting. And then the dissociative phenomena that is involved with having complex PTSD. And again, complex PTSD is if you had pre-existing trauma, generally in childhood, which can be physical, sexual, abandonment, those traumas that pre-existed prior to having the exposure to the combat trauma. Does that make sense? So you have a foundation of trauma, and then we're adding on the military experience on top of that. So combat-related trauma, we have a direct combat, witnessing death. There's moral dilemmas that go along with the combat-related trauma. Traumas for military personnel are often very different than civilians in the fact that you're engaging the trauma, you're participating in the trauma. Not only are you enduring the trauma, but do you guys at times cause trauma?
Yes.
And then you have the ethical and the moral dilemma with that. Contrary, sometimes with civilians, oftentimes they're victims of trauma, but do they actively participate in the trauma in the same way that military personnel do? Generally no. So that's something for you to keep in mind. Some of the unique symptoms that are primarily to military personnel is the hypervigilance. Now that isn't to say that there isn't hypervigilance with civilians, but it's a little bit different. They may be hypervigilant about the area where the trauma occurred, but they're not always going to be on that heightened state of alert as our combat PTSD clients are. Veterans are also more likely to experience the heightened startle reflex and intense flashbacks related to a specific combat experience. If we're talking about my veterans who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're talking about the urban warfare, when you are going throughout your day-to-day life, now that we're back in States and we're back home, there's a lot of things that mirror the surroundings that you have while you're on deployment, right? That amount of exposure to things that could be called triggers, I'm not a super fan of that word, but it is legitimate, like things do trigger those emotional and physical responses. It's very much different than it is for somebody who maybe experienced like early childhood physical abuse. They will avoid like the perpetrator of the trauma, right? But it's not a matter of like kicking trash on the side of the road at every chance you get because it might be an IED. Like the amount of exposure to things that trigger you is way disproportionate for combat related trauma than it is for civilian related trauma. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Keith. The National Center for PTSD reports that between 11 and 20% of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan were diagnosed with PTSD as it compared to 7% in the civilian world. Does that sound right to you? Because it sure doesn't sound right to me in my practice. Because, and we can take in for, like, I want you to take into account too with some of these statistics that I'm giving you. Like the statistics are only as good as the information that people are willing to provide. How many folks in this room who have probably a diagnosis of PTSD knew that they had PTSD when they got home? Like I have Vietnam vets who didn't realize that they had a problem until they retired. And then their minds started like taking over because they didn't have something to distract them. Because up until that point, and they even talked about this at group on Monday, everybody else had the problem, not me. That's pretty common. So civilian sources of trauma include natural disasters, accidents, assaults. PTSD symptoms generally include anxiety, depression, avoidance. The next slide that I'm going to show you, I thought this podium would be bigger, so I apologize. So it's going to tell you this here in a second, but I really want you to pay attention because I had to rewatch it like 3 times, and we're not going to do that today. The sound that goes along with this video is not from actual combat. The second half of the video is going to show you what the actual sounds come from. But I love this video and the fact that it really paints the picture of how military or combat-related PTSD impacts us on a day-to-day basis, which is a little bit different than civilian-related PTSD. So fingers crossed that the technology gods are with us. Isn't that a trip? It's so, so profound. Oh boy. How do I do that? Escape. Thank you.
Escape.
Another escape?
Yep.
Oh, you're so good. And then,
Shift F5 and then right.
DOS.
F5.
Or you can do slideshow.
Where is it?
There it is. So if you haven't picked up on it, I'm a little neurospicy too, so sometimes I get flooded. Just how do I get it to go?
Oh, from Kurt's slide. That's why I hate computers.
Sorry guys. I will never say I'm super computer literate. My husband's in IT, so I've allowed myself not to know anything about it. And I'm so thankful for him. So now we're going to compare and contrast symptoms for combat versus civilians. Combat veterans have vivid flashbacks. So like we oftentimes think of flashbacks as being where you are like stuck in that moment and you're seeing like for Vietnam veterans perhaps jungle around you, or you're experiencing that urban warfare where you're seeing and engaging that actual war scene, but it can be those sounds. Like, did you catch how the alarm clock like matched up perfectly with the helicopter? Like, that was a trip. Or the nail gun. So many different things on the day-to-day life can cause those little mini microcosm flashbacks, and what happens when that happens? We get that emotional and physical response, right? I have a vet that I know, and he works in an environment where he wears a hard hat. And this is one of the, I love this example because it's so real, and I think that it would resonate with a lot of people. So he had like multiple deployments, right? And he was at work and he works on a team. And he put on his hard helmet and he was gathering his stuff to go to work with his team. And after like 20 minutes, his team's like, hey man, where are you at? He's like, and then I realized I didn't realize where I was at, and I was looking for my weapon that whole entire time. Because the hard hat mimicked the Kevlar. Like so many different nuances can happen to them on a day-to-day basis. Civilians, do they have vivid memories? Can they have flashbacks? Yeah, but they're less frequent and they're less intense. Avoidance symptoms. Combat vets, broader avoidance. Every one of you that's in this room that's a veteran, give yourself a pat on the back because you're here and there's tons of people around you and you can't control this environment really. That takes a lot to get here. Like getting into this parking garage and then my roof rack hit the parking garage. Like I was ready to leave and I don't have combat experience. So we like to avoid things that make us uncomfortable, right? Civilians oftentimes have specific avoidance. So if they got in a car wreck, they don't want to drive. If there's an accident on the bridge, they want to avoid that bridge. It's not as broad of a spectrum as it is with combat-related PTSD. Hyperarousal and hypervigilance. Combat vets typically experience that constant state of alertness, that hyperarousal, where you're always on the lookout, assessing the room, assessing the individuals, assessing what you can use in the room, my Marines. Civilians, less intense. They might have awareness, but it's not going to be the same intensity level as someone who had a 12 or 18-month deployment, right? Or even an 8-month deployment in the evasions. Cognitive and mood alterations. Combat veterans experience guilt and shame. Why do you guys think that there might be the addition of guilt and shame for PTSD with combat vets as opposed? What was that?
Survivor's guilt.
Survivor's guilt, that's a good one. That's an excellent example. Yep.
Remorse from having to kill someone?
Yep, remorse from having to kill somebody, absolutely. Having to engage in things that you wouldn't have engaged in otherwise, that whole moral dilemma. Those are all things that impact combat vets. Where civilians, they have trauma-specific mood changes, but it isn't in the same vein as where it's impacting, like they have the self-guilt. Very rarely do civilians have to deal with that as well. This picture, and I think I already alluded to it earlier, with the trash on the side of the road, just another example of how combat veterans are exposed to things on a day-to-day basis that are normal to somebody who isn't, but I have a lot of guys that would pull over on the side of the road and kick that because they're afraid it's what? An IED. Do civilians do that? Generally not. But all part of the spectrum, all the color red, just different versions, right? So we kind of have a basis for understanding post-traumatic stress disorder and the difference between civilian and combat related. Now let's talk about the interplay of traumatic brain injury. So here's another statistic at the very bottom of the slide where I'm like, I don't know about that. According to the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, approximately 22% of all combat veterans' injuries involve a TBI. 22%. Do you think that's accurate? Does everybody that has returned from a deployment get a TBI screening? And if you do get a screening, is it somebody with a clipboard asking you questions as opposed to actually like doing an MRI or doing a brain scan? So with all that being said, the only reason why I want to point out how statistics can be skewed is when you're working with veterans, I also want you to keep this in the back of the mind. Even though they don't have a diagnosed TBI, is there a possibility? Yes. Another population that's been grossly overlooked for traumatic brain injury would include my Vietnam veterans. Now, Vietnam, as opposed to Iraq and Afghanistan, did they have to deal with the IED thing in the same vein as what Iraq, Afghanistan? Nope. But did they have landmines? Yes. I have a vet that I work with whose truck got blown up and turned over by a landmine, and he like launched into a rice paddy. He's never been assessed for traumatic brain injury. Is there a good chance he's got one? That's a pretty big fall, and he's a pretty big dude. So it's a possibility. So things that can cause traumatic brain injury, blunt force trauma, explosive devices, gunshot wounds. Yes, sir.
I was just gonna say, I don't know how it was in Vietnam, but the way they establish your baseline for TBI is during mobilization, you go out in the field all day and you're super exhausted, and then they give you a test. So that's your baseline. And there's a mandatory 24 hours of rest if you're in country and you get blown up. They have to give you a lot of rest before you take your test, which jacks your score up. So they establish the baseline.
When you're already smoked.
Yeah, they establish the baseline pretty low, and then you get lots of rest when they determine whether or not you get the TBI. So yeah, you're the thumb's on the scale on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Also, something else to really take into consideration, right? Like how some of these assessments can be impacted by just the way we administer them. Does somebody else have something to say? I don't know, we're looking. Did you, sir?
I just said it's called a MACE exam.
A MACE exam? Cool. Okay, we have blunt force trauma, that was the other one. So, TBI is bad, but why is TBI bad? It impacts particular regions of our brain that are involved with emotional regulation, memory, such as the hippocampus and the amygdala. Have you guys heard of the amygdala before? That's your reptilian brain. It's about the size of a walnut. It's your fight or flight mechanism. And your hippocampus is your memory center. And your memory center is like at the base of your brain. So your amygdala is your fight or flight, and then you have the hippocampus, that's your memory center. When you get activated by your adrenal system, your hippocampus takes charge, the walnut, your reptilian brain, and your hippocampus shrinks, your memory center, because you're only in survival mode, right? You don't need your memory center to remember or to be able to survive the trauma. You need to have those gut natural instincts. There are also cognitive impairments in exacerbating PTSD. There's it impairs the brain's ability to process trauma, and it also causes inflammation in the brain, and that also is linked with increased symptoms of PTSD. So if you have inflammation in your knee and you have arthritis, does your knee work as good? Can you PT and run like you used to? If your brain has inflammation, which you can't see, which is a booger, because it'd be nice if you could see it, because then you would see the cause and effect. Do you think your brain works as effectively as it could? No, because it's all swollen, like your knee with arthritis. And TBI can impact all of those things. So these are SPECT scans, and because I am not a neuroscientist at this point in time, maybe someday, I'm going to tell you what a SPECT scan is from the book so I don't mess it up. So it's a single photon emission computed tomography. The scan is a type of nuclear imaging test that measures the blood flow in the brain. It involves injecting a small amount of radioactive tracer into the bloodstream. This tracer emits gamma rays, which are detected by a gamma camera that rotates around the head, capturing images from multiple angles. These things are really cool. They can diagnose stroke, dementia, seizures, brain injuries, psychiatric disorders. This first set of images I'm gonna show you, they were done by the Amen Clinic. At the time they were out of Bellevue, now they're out of Tukwila. It's a really cool facility. It's not covered by the VA. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry for interrupting, but I thought it'd be important to say that what I've noticed over the years is that the VA will not consider, in a lot of cases, mild traumatic brain injury unless the veteran was knocked unconscious. So the golden thread for service connection and making different diagnosis between trauma anxiety and which is a cognitive impairment, and PTSD is a medic has to log that the veteran, the service member was knocked unconscious. So that's a very key word that must be noted by the military, is unconscious. I've done some research on that, and it makes sense, but a lot of veterans, I think, in my opinion, were exposed to mild traumatic brain injury, and the medic or whoever was responsible failed to document that. So just kind of a little bit of heads up with what you're saying and the connection between PTSD and mild or moderate traumatic brain injury.
Well, and that's helpful to know too, if that's a distinguishing factor. So when you're writing nexus letters and you're trying to distinguish the symptoms of traumatic brain injury from PTSD, if they do have an unconscious event, whether it was documented by a medic or not, because I know all of my veterans' injuries were documented by medics. In what world? I mean, the Marines that's one of their strengths. They're really good at documenting stuff. I'm not even joking. That's insane how well they document stuff. That wasn't even a joke. I love my Marines. But yeah, oftentimes we don't have the documentation that we need to support the assessment for the injury. All right, so these two pictures are SPECT scans. I just read to you, so it's measuring blood flow in the brain. The first image is the scan while the brain is at rest. That means this is in a doctor's office. It's a completely calm environment, although like if you have any white coat anxiety, like there might be a little bit of anxiety related to that, because who doesn't when they're going to a doctor? Obviously in that top picture where you see the hole, that's a TBI. That shouldn't show up in the original picture, but it does because this person has a pretty severe frontal lobe TBI. And then you see this dimpling, that's like right there. That's actually indicative of heavy toxic metal load. Burn pits, anybody? Burn pits, depleted uranium. This is a veteran, by the way. So that's at rest. The next picture shows the brain under stress. And definition of stress in these pictures is going from just sitting comfortably calm in a doctor's office to having to read like a script on a computer screen. Has nothing to do with trauma, has nothing to do with the military. It's like Dick sees dog, Jane sees Dick. Like super simple, benign. Can you see the exacerbation of the symptoms from rest to stress? Look at those holes. Look at the dimpling, it becomes more severe and profound. So if this is doing nothing, reading a script, what do you think that brain looks like on I-5? What do you think that brain looks like on I-5 with a screaming infant in the back? Stress.
Heather?
Yes, sir, ma'am.
Okay, probably 20 years ago, there's a psychiatric nurse here in Spokane, and she called it the blue brain. This is before all this kind of fancy stuff, but it was years ago with heat sensors, and you took because Vietnam vets were young, and I call it, they were, I'm not a medical person, but their brain was stunted because of the trauma that they had, if I'm saying that right. And so if you took two guys, 40 and 40, one had trauma, one didn't, there would be less electronic technology going on. It'd be blue brain, and that was a good term. And then a regular person that didn't have trauma, they had yellow and red and all that. So is that kind of a good analysis of that? And then this newer technology explains that with the bumps and things like that, right?
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, that's a pretty good.
I haven't heard of what you're talking about before, but it sounds like it was the precursor.
Right, that's what it was probably 20 years ago when that happened. But they showed us, brain scans, the heat ones, and it was a blue brain because all those synapses and whatever that is was stunted because of the trauma that they got. And most of them were younger, 18 to 21 years old, so they were stunted in their growth, I call it that. They're stunted in their growth, and they didn't go beyond that very much, some of the ones I knew and served with.
That is a possibility. Thank you for that added insight. I didn't realize that they were doing stuff like that with young Vietnam vets when they got back. That's pretty cool. Any questions about that set of pictures? So I've got another set of pictures. So this is also a SPECT scan. It is measuring something different. Again, the first image, can you see it okay on the screen?
Yes.
Because it just looks like black and red on.
Well,
Can you see the brain?
I can see it from the front row, if that's, yeah.
Are these lights?
We'll find out.
Yeah, we will.
Good. Good.
Aww.
That's better.
Better? Okay, so the brain is going this way, and the brain is going this way. So this is the back, and this is the middle. And the same thing with the top picture. The lower part's this part of the brain, and this part's right in there. And this is the side view, so right here to right here. So under rest, you see everything that's lit up. And I've got to figure out how to fix this for the future, because this is pretty significant. Because you go from stress to stress, rest to stress. Again, stress is just reading a benign script on a computer screen in a doctor's office, cool, collected, calm environment. We went from that much stuff being online in this circle and all those brains that you really can't see very well because of the blue. That's the amygdala. So when this person was put under stress, the only thing that was online was what? His reptilian brain. What do you think that looks like on I-5? What do you think that looks like with the screaming baby in the middle of the night with the TBI?
The 4th of July.
What was that, sir?
The 4th of July.
Oh, the 4th of July. Yeah, no, that thing's just in charge on the 4th of July. You're just walking around in that fight or flight response. It's crazy to think about, because we don't oftentimes get to see the physical representation of PTSD, right? We know the emotional, we know the behavioral, but we don't get to see the mechanics of it. And that's why I love these SPECT scans. And I'll figure out how to make those better for next time. Sorry about that. So, I used the one of the amygdala, which is that reptilian brain. That's the only thing that's lit up in that second picture when we're under stress, because we're leading right into the adrenal system. The adrenal system and the HP axis regulates the production of cortisol and other hormones that are critical for managing stress. What is cortisol? Does anybody know what's so important about the hormone cortisol? Do we know what it manages?
Autonomic nervous system.
Yep. And who said pain? Yep. Did anybody say stress? Yep. So it's critical for managing that. Your adrenals are on the top of your kidneys. And I don't want to lose this. And your HPA axis involves your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland, and your adrenal glands. And all those things work together to produce cortisol. Combat trauma can lead to the dysregulation of the HPA axis and cortisol levels, as well as other hormonal imbalances. What is different between civilian PTSD and combat-related PTSD? What's another thing that's different? Who had a year-long deployment in here? Who had multiple year-long deployments? Who had an 18-month deployment? Who had multiple 18-month-long deployments? There's more than I thought. That's a lot. So if you're in a state of duress and stress for 12 to 18 months at a shot, where your life is being threatened every single day, whether you're going inside or out of the wire, your life is being threatened every single day because you're in a combat zone, and combat zone means what? You're at war, and all the things that go along with it. Your body goes into that mode where it's producing all the cortisol you need, all the epinephrine you need, which is also adrenaline, because adrenaline is just wonderful during combat. Because, why? It makes all of your spidey senses come on, right? Everything like cues in, you don't need to eat as much, your immune system does go down because it's putting all of that energy into making sure that you have enough energy to survive and fight to live another day. It's pretty remarkable. But 365 days of it, it can make some things not work as well as they had previously. It'd be like redlining your car every single day on the way to work. What's gonna happen eventually? There's something that's gonna start flashing on your dash and you're not gonna know what it is, and then you're gonna have to go and get it fixed. So with that elevated level of cortisol, which by the way, cortisol typically is higher in the morning, which is your stress hormone. Why do you think we need it higher in the morning? Your levels to be naturally high in the morning.
You're getting ready to face the day.
You're getting ready to face the day. If you had low cortisol, it'd be like dragging your tail out of bed and you'd just be like walking in waist deep mud. But that cortisol kind of gives you that little boost and pep to where you can start your day and get rolling. If you have too much cortisol, which is oftentimes correlated with those long extended deployments, it can cause your body to continue to be in fight or flight. And I'm sorry, my brain is not keeping up with my mouth, or my mouth isn't keeping up with my brain, and that's really embarrassing. In combat, this response is sustained over long periods, leading to chronically high cortisol levels. The negative things that go along with high cortisol levels, or that hypercortisolism, includes immune system suppression, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and cognitive impairment. All right, cognitive impairment. So not only does TBI cause cognitive impairment, now we've got the adrenal system and having too much cortisol causing cognitive impairment. Do you think that makes it a little bit challenging when you're trying to do cognitive behavioral therapy with veterans? It's a complicator, right? It's complicated. Any questions about hypercortisolism? Because the next one's gonna be hypo. So hypo, as opposed to hyper, is low levels of cortisol. It's associated with the body's stress response becoming blunted after long exposure to trauma. In combat, this response is sustained over long periods, leading to chronically high cortisol levels. But because of those chronically high cortisol levels, your system just crashes. And then you have hypo, where it's chronically low. So these are the people who have chronic fatigue, chronic depression, and heightened inflammatory responses. Inflammation, here's another thing. So we've got the adrenal system causing inflammation. We can have TBI causing inflammation. All the things impair your ability to be present and aware and acutely engaged in the therapeutic process. So all of these things are multipliers. If somebody has inflammation, even from drinking causes inflammation in the brain and in your body. Can that impact your ability to work through trauma? Absolutely. Inflammation is a big deal. And then, not only do we have cortisol being impacted by the adrenal system and being in high risk situations for a long extended period of time, we have DHEA. I'm sure some of you guys have heard of DHEA before. It's a really popular health supplement because sometimes it can help kick a body back into producing testosterone. But those high extended periods of high levels of cortisol can cause your DHEA levels to go in the tank, which impacts your testosterone and your estrogen production. For men, low testosterone. Do you guys know what low testosterone looks like in men? Because it's a big deal. Fatigue, depression, lack of motivation, a beer belly that's not really a beer belly. It's from low testosterone. But it's like a little pudgy thing. Like oftentimes I have guys like, I just don't feel like doing anything that I used to like to do. Like I have a guy that's super into, what's that called? Like motocross with dirt bikes. Can't make himself do it anymore. His motivation is low. Guess what? He had really low testosterone. Body fat goes up. Fatigue, also anemia, is also associated with low testosterone in men. And here's one, sleep disturbance. Not only does it cause insomnia, it also causes fragmented sleep. So gentlemen who have low testosterone can also wake up multiple times during the day, or during the night. And what happens when you guys wake up with multiple times during the night if you have combat-related PTSD? That hamster gets on that wheel, and it just starts thinking about all the things. That's not helpful. Low estrogen in women is also not a good thing, which is the precursor. So you have DHEA. So for men, it primarily produces testosterone. Women also has testosterone. Men also have estrogen, but primarily that's our sex hormone, but men also have a little bit of it. It causes weight gain. It causes mood fluctuations. It causes memory decline. That's no fun. And low energy. So you're in a combat environment for 12 to 18 months. Your cortisol levels are like, yeah, we got this. We're gonna keep you safe. You're safe. You made it through. And then what happens? Your body just crashes. And then you have this cascading domino effect where you have other hormones like your DHEA, your testosterone, your estrogen that are all impacting your day-to-day ability to function well. That is then compounding the severity of your symptoms of PTSD and compounding the symptoms of your TBI. Super complicated. But I'm hoping you're gonna take some of this because it has dramatically changed how successful some of the clients in my practice are by combining all of these things and trying to helping these people from a holistic approach. Long-term consequences of adrenal dysregulation can include cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders. Did you know, and I didn't know this until I went down this rabbit hole and did all this research, that dysregulation of cortisol can lead to metabolic disturbances such as insulin resistance, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. I didn't know about the type 2 diabetes. That was pretty fascinating. It also causes immune dysfunction and mental health disorders, which is no surprise because your body's completely dysregulated and it can't cue in your stress hormones when you need to have it and it's doing it in inappropriate times. What does that make you feel? Like a little unsettled, right? All right, now we're gonna get into the big stuff. Childhood abuse as a precursor to complex PTSD in veterans. Any questions about that stuff before we move on to this? Yes, sir.
So, as you're discussing about cortisol levels and all that aspect, you're saying that it'll spike and then it drops down. Is there any point within there that it may retain at a particular higher level or lower level, and then medication has to support the correction of that?
Good question. So, someone with normal, whatever normal is, normal cortisol levels, it'll be higher in the morning and it fluctuates out throughout the day and it starts going lower at night because we're getting ready to go to sleep, right? So there's a fluctuation. There are things that can be done to regulate your cortisol and to get things back on track, but that should always be done by a medical provider. I would never be giving medical advice here. So always talk to your medical provider before starting any supplementation. But I've had a lot of success with vets who have either the ability or insurance through their employer to go through naturopaths. Some primary care physicians in the traditional medical world will touch this. But it's a matter of testing the cortisol first thing in the morning, sending that off with a specific test to see where that person is and where they fluctuate. Because in the morning, it should be high, but it should fluctuate throughout the day. Kind of like thyroid levels. Thyroid levels naturally fluctuate throughout the day. And so you just have to figure out what that person's range is, kind of similar to cortisol. But with somebody who has adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout, it's going to be so low. Same thing with the testosterone. Normal range, I think by traditional doctors currently is 200 to 800 on testosterone. Meanwhile, I'll send a 36-year-old healthy male to go to their primary care doc to get their testosterone checked, and it's at 200. Again, the range is 200 to 800, and that is that range is developed by taking testosterone levels across the male population to come up with that average or that range. A 36-year-old man should not be at the very bottom level of that. Maybe one of my 80-year-old guys, but not my 36-year-old guys. It's about where it is for each individual. Does that make sense? Okay. So there is a higher risk of complex PTSD in veterans who have had child abuse histories, and there's some exacerbation of that primary and secondary trauma by being exposed to the military environment. What do you think can be complicating about being in the military and that culture, about being do you guys go to sick call? Should you go to sick call? I'm just blown away somebody was documenting injuries on the field. Because you're supposed to suck it up, be tough, right?
Stigma.
What'd you say?
Stigma.
I can't hear you.
Stigma.
Yeah, there's a lot of stigma. So it's all about being resilient, being tough, and living to fight another day. So if you had some emotional experience or things like bubble to the surface while you're at basic training, do you think you would have gone to your drill sergeant and been drill sergeant, I want to talk to the chaplain about my feelings? Would that have gone well? I mean, we would like to say it would, but reality, right?
That's funny. Got lumber. Oh, you got it.
Oh, yeah. Well, we had another picture that I wasn't a fan of. I'm like, just give me the cat in the toilet one. That's always a winner. And he does kind of look disassociated, right? He's just staring into space. How did I get here? So there's a dissociative phenomena in complex PTSD. And this is derived from the dissociative identity disorder, DID. Old-fashioned term for that would be, does anybody have a guess? Multiple personality disorders. Is it like in the movies? Generally not. I don't know if you guys saw that movie. What was it?
Civil. Yeah, civil.
Not Civil. Split. Was it Split, the most recent one? Where the guy had 800. It was something crazy, but brilliant acting. Completely not appropriate, or you can compare it to what really goes on. But he was pretty impressive going from the beast to this little kid. Anyway, so there's two different types. You have protect parts, and protect parts aren't disassociative. They're usually really present, and they are there to help advocate for that person and to help protect them. And then you have dissociative splits. And dissociative splits are in those types of situations or scenarios where the trauma or the situation is so severe and so extreme that the person has to disassociate and compartmentalize. And sometimes that is related to not remembering the event itself, because this dissociative split, that protective part, that's a dissociative split, took over and was in control to help that person survive because the trauma was so overwhelming and so flooding. Does that make sense? So protective parts generally retain their memory of the events. They may act out of character, but it's always to protect the veteran or the individual that they are being demonstrated through. And it was something that I believe you said, my dear, where somebody has a TBI and they kind of get stuck in that age. Oftentimes you'll see that dissociative splits or protect parts, if they had trauma like at 14 years old, that protect part will demonstrate the maturity and the reaction and rationale of like a 14-year-old, which is super fascinating. Or a 22-year-old young man who just got back from war, demonstrated by a 70-year-old man sitting in my office from Vietnam. They're just things to consider, and it's fascinating. It makes it super complicated and super spicy, right? Because not only do I have the individual that's sitting in front of me in my office, and then I'm starting to see these other parts of this person start to manifest, and it's like, wow, that's really out of character. But the more and more you start developing that rapport and that trust with that person, they start allowing themselves to expose themselves, then you can start distinguishing like, oh, that's your little girl self, right? So let's talk about that. It's about figuring out where those protect parts are and those dissociative splits are, and figuring out how to reintegrate them into the person as a whole. Does that make sense? All right, stay with me. The other thing that is really interesting is you've got an adult woman who's super successful, who has a protect part that's like a young girl or a young child girl, and you're trying to help that adult woman realize you're autonomous now. You can protect yourself just like combat vets can too, right? Like, we're not in deployment anymore. We don't need those dissociative splits. We don't need to have those extreme reactions. But trying to help them understand that they can become whole again because of their environment and their circumstances is really empowering. When you can help empower your patients, that gets them invested and that helps get them invested in the healing process. Does that make sense? Because it always makes sense in my head, but sometimes it doesn't make sense when it comes out of my mouth. Yes, ma'am.
Do they know that they're doing this, that they have these splits?
Excellent. No. She asked, do people know when they have the splits or if they know if they have the protect parts? I have never met somebody that's walked in my office that was aware that they had this a part of them. Oftentimes, it is through developing the relationship and the rapport. Sometimes it's also bringing in a spouse to understand that, to be able to compare and contrast where they're at baseline versus how they act and react when they're triggered, so to speak, and that amygdala is taking over. Because there can be situations where I'll use an example from a couple years ago. I had a married couple, and they had just got back from a trip camping in their camper, and it was just them, no kids allowed. And it was wonderful. Wife reported that it was great and that she felt really connected and had a great intimate connection with her husband that they hadn't had in a long time. It was going swimmingly well. Something happened that caused the husband to get triggered, right? Combat vet. And all of a sudden, everybody was an enemy. She was the enemy. That never happened. I don't love you. I want a divorce. This marriage has never worked. All of the things, which wasn't reality. But that dissociative split, 1000% believed it. So it was about using grounding techniques. It was about trying to help him better regulate his automatic fight or flight system to where he could recognize it, and then helping him understand once he came out of that fight or flight. Remember when you said this? Did you mean that? No. I don't, and sometimes they don't even remember saying it, by the way. But this person didn't remember saying it because his reality, his true reality was, we had a great time, we had this intimate connection, all the things were butterflies and rainbows, but as soon as that split took place, we were going in fight or flight. And why were we going to fight or flight? Because we were gonna die, because you guys are automatically conditioned in the military through basic training and all the wonderful training you get to fight for what? Your life, every single time. Every single time you're fighting for your life. And that's why, like, I will always make the argument, you know how people say, like, there's always a little bit of truth when somebody says something in anger? I wouldn't necessarily apply that to combat vets, because when you guys get activated to a certain, this isn't excusing it, by the way, this is explaining it. When you get activated and you get ramped up and you're in that fight or flight mode, the walnut's in charge, and you've got all this inflammation, all of your adrenal stuff kicking off and doing its things, you'll say and do whatever you need to say or do just to get out of that conflict, even if it's the meanest, nastiest thing ever. 3 days from then, do you mean it? Generally not. But it's that automatic condition response that started in your basic training. Because think about the cadences we used to sing. They're crazy. It's all about killing and murdering people.
Not all of them.
Not all of them, you're right. There's tiny bubbles. I love tiny bubbles. But a lot of them are.
The softness cadence is about taking care of your lady too. Very inappropriate.
Would you care to share some? I think you should share some.
Go.
She wore a yellow ribbon, that's it.
Yeah, that was a good one. I remember that one. And what happens is, and this is why I have the Jack in the Box. I forgot I had it. I would use it earlier. When you have PTSD, can you box it up and compartmentalize it in your brain and throw it away like a key from a safe? Boy, don't we wish. Watch, it's not gonna work. I just bought this. There we go. It's more like this. You're just going along, enjoying your day. And then your alarm clock goes off, or somebody has a nail gun, or whatever from that video, and what happens? You can't anticipate when that little sucker's gonna pop up, right? That's why I have the Jack in the Box. He's pretty cool. But no, generally people don't realize that they have trauma splits, and they also don't realize that they have protective parts. It's our job as clinicians to help them figure that out, and that is super complicated, and it takes a long time because you have to develop that rapport and trust with the individual. The other thing that we find with people who have childhood trauma, especially if it's from their primary caregivers like mom or dad, or other like close familial relationships, that can also lead to a thing called attachment disorder. Have any of you guys heard of attachment disorder? Attachment disorder is where you fail to have like true lasting connections with individuals because nobody's safe. And so then we also have to figure out how to have an alliance with this individual who has no safe relationships, or in their perspective has no safe relationships pre-existing, and that's rooted from early childhood trauma. And then you go into the military. Sometimes they gain some trusting relationships and through the camaraderie and the brotherhood, right, which is awesome. But does leadership always do us well in the military? I'm making broad sweeping statements. So if there's any officers, I'm not trying to be insulting. Broad sweeping statements. So then we have to also help them trust us, that we have their absolute best interest in heart, to help them understand how these things have impacted their relationships moving forward. Does that make sense? It's super complicated.
And Heather, what was that called again? The buzzword, the word you said in the beginning of it?
Detachment.
Detachment?
Yeah. Okay, right, thanks. I was
Okay.
listening to the end instead of the front, sorry. Thank you.
That's all right. I wasn't listening to any of it.
We'll keep you online.
That'd be too much. So some therapeutic approaches to addressing protect parts and trauma splits, internal family systems therapy, which is amazing. The very first training that I did that exposed me to all of this, not all of it, but the splits and the protect parts, was a training on trauma and borderline personality disorder. Oftentimes you'll see a strong correlation with people who have borderline personality disorder have a significant history of trauma. And that borderline behavior is like protect parts, where they're overreacting, over-exaggerating, pushing people away, pulling people close, trying to get that sense of stability that's all rooted in trauma. And so learning that started me on this journey. I'm really thankful for that training by PESI. So if you see it, it was a PESI training. So it's about identifying and communicating with the parts. So you're identifying each of those protect parts or dissociative splits. And one of the most significant challenges is the resistance. Oops, wrong one. That was not the page I thought it was. I do apologize, my friends. Internal family system is based on the premise that the mind is naturally divided into subpersonalities or parts, each with its own perspective, emotions, and roles. In the context of CPTSD, internal family systems helps individuals identify and communicate with their protect parts, facilitating a process of healing and integration. So it's helping them identify what those protect parts look like and helping them identify ways for them to reconcile and to bring them all into them as a unified whole. We also have trauma-informed therapy. That's another good one. They're trained to recognize and respond to the signs of protect parts and trauma splits using techniques such as grounding, mindfulness, stabilization to help individuals feel safe and in control during therapy. And that, again, is also super tricky if you're dealing with somebody with attachment disorder who's never had a healthy relationship with another adult. So it's a lot of trust building and developing that rapport. And then you have eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, EMDR. That stuff is voodoo magic. I love it. I highly recommend it if you've never participated in it before. So for those of you that are unaware, sometimes it's a matter of a light bar chasing right to left or left to right, back and forth. Or sometimes there's like little buzzers that you can hold in your hand that they'll buzz, rotating one side to the other. And the whole goal of that is to stimulate the right and left hemisphere of your brain so they sync. So your supercomputer is working as a whole, and that helps you process traumatic experience and helps reintegrate those protect parts or trauma splits into one again, because it's causing your whole brain to work as a whole and in synchronicity. I didn't know if I could get that last word out. So, challenges of treating veterans with complex PTSD, resistance to therapy by protect parts. If I've got a female veteran who had sexual trauma at 14 and then also had military combat related PTSD as a young adult in my office, do you think that she wants to hear anything that I have to say about doing breathing exercises when you're anxious? It's the worst. Or take off your shoes and go outside and stare at the sun and ground. All of those things are wonderful, by the way, and I'm being like a little facetious because I do all those things, but when you are in that fight or flight state, that's the last thing you want to do. Even for me, like I get wound up, I'm like, I should really go outside and take deep breaths and put my bare feet in the ground, but I don't want to do that. I want to listen to this rage music or whatever it is. We always fight ourselves with those internal dilemmas, and those are like little baby protect parts, right? Like, no, we don't want to do this. We want to lean into it. And then you have the complexity of internal systems. So if you're dealing with somebody who has early childhood trauma, and it's almost that like arrested development term where you've got somebody that's got the maturity of the 14-year-old with a protect part, and then you've got somebody that's got trauma in their early 20s, so that's a little bit more mature, and let's just throw in some trauma in their 30s. So you're seeing this whole spectrum of maturity, and you don't know who's gonna show up to therapy that day. It's a real trip. And sometimes, how many of you guys, whether or not you're a veteran yourself or married to a veteran, your veteran walks out in the living room and you're like, oh, that guy's here today. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Where the body posture is different, the face is different, the way that they walk is different, everything is different. There's a split. It's been a protected part. Isn't that like a ha-ha, now I get it. But sometimes when you can paint that picture for the veteran, because they've gotten that feedback from their wife or their kids, it's an aha moment. It really is. It's just about doing it in a loving way, because we're all humans, and every single person in this room's got shit, including myself, right? None of us are perfect. We're all here to try to help heal. Well, in my world, in my ideals, we're all here to help heal ourselves and heal each other and heal our community and end the generational trauma. And then you also have the influence of military culture on treatment. So again, there's stigma going to get mental health while you're still active duty. Does that prevent promotion at times? Mm-hmm. Does it prevent PCS at times? Mm-hmm. It prevents a whole vast majority of things. And then there's people who actually ask for help. And they come back from a deployment, they're not doing well, they ask for help, and sometimes they get told that they're malingering. Is that helpful? Yes, ma'am.
I've had a friend fake alcoholism to get help. She faked having a drinking problem so she could get therapy. She's still in.
But she's getting therapy for PTSD?
She's getting therapy for alcoholism, but she just wanted any kind of therapy, so they weren't getting her in fast enough for just basic therapy, so she said she drank a lot, so they got her in faster.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, it's not great, but she got in.
I don't know if that's a trick of the trade.
I feel like it might need to be.
It could be a trick of the trade.
But I'm saying it's a negative thing that she had to face.
Right, absolutely. If you are communicating that you need help, it needs to be immediate, right? Like currently our CBOC, our local community-based outpatient clinic for the VA in Wenatchee Valley, we haven't had any therapists out there for a year and a half. It's just like, wow. But you know what we got 2 weeks ago? Armed security guards.
Because that's the answer.
Yay! You guys, if you don't have any influence or like if you haven't started trying to advocate with your legislators, it's always good to hear more voices saying the same things. All right, I had a girlfriend make this picture because I think the idea of it really encapsulates the complex PTSD because you have the veteran in the background, and then maybe you have like the little kid that he was that got physically abused by his dad, or whatever the thing may be. And our whole goal is to keep that, fix that separation to where you're whole as an individual. But does that happen a lot? It sure does. And does it always happen? So I'm talking about combat-related PTSD, but I guarantee you, there's people in this room whose parents have this going on. Like, this has been something that's been chronic in our country for a long, long time. And we're just now starting to understand the complexity of PTSD and the multifacetedness of it as far as early childhood, then compounded by adult trauma. So here's some more of their fancy statistics. 35% of female and 17% of male military personnel reported childhood abuse. I don't know if I really trust those statistics. I have a vet center contract with the Seattle Vet Center. It's wonderful. We get to see anybody who has a qualified combat deployment in my office, free of charge to them. So we're able to really focus on their needs, and it's amazing. But one of the things that we get to do with that is an intake assessment. And in the first part of the intake assessment, do you have a history of childhood or physical or sexual abuse? How many people answer that question honestly? Like, honestly. I can think of several individuals that are in my practice that have been with me for a while. When I first asked them that question, like, nope, never had any of that go on. Meanwhile, I later found out that their stepmom started grooming them at 8 years old, sleeping in the bed with them, and then started having intercourse with them as soon as they were sexually able to reproduce. That's sexual trauma. But they didn't report it. Why didn't you think they report it? It could be shame. It could be like the whole rationalization is like, well, I'm a dude and I got to like do the Stacy's mom thing. Like it's so complicated. I also have a gentleman that told me that he didn't have any history of physical or sexual abuse. And then after being with him for a couple years, he was telling me about his early childhood on an Indian reservation on the other side of the mountains, and he was half white, half native, and he wasn't white enough and he wasn't native enough, so he got beat up a lot. And I'm not judging anything, it's just the way it was. And then he was telling me about going to school and seeing people that were passed out with needles in the arms because they had overdosed. I'm like, you don't find that traumatic? He's like, no, it's just the way it was. Okay, well that's generally not in the normal spectrum of early childhood in the United States currently, because he's my age. He's like 30, 40. Well, I mean, there's something to be said for that. Like the boomers, corporal punishment was a thing, like across the board. You got hacked at school, and then you get hacked by dad when you got home, and then if dad remembered a couple hours later, you might get another whopping. Like it was way more prevalent, the corporal and physical punishment for that generation right above the Gen X folks. And Gen X, I mean, they're the older Gen X kids. You guys got hacked in high school too, right? Like I know my brother did, a lot. I didn't, because I was perfect. Oh yeah, I learned how to get out of things because of my older brother, for sure. So these statistics, although those are reported, I would also take those with a grain of salt because not everybody is honest about reporting when they're asked. Are we shocked that there was a higher prevalence of early childhood abuse in the Army and the Marine Corps? Why do you think that is? Think about who generally goes into the Army and the Marine Corps. Again, broad sweeping statements. This isn't the rule. Yes, sir.
As a prior Army recruiter, we take applicants from all social areas and aptitudes. Therefore, we're going to have a higher percentage of people coming from, let's say, poor communities.
Socioeconomics absolutely influences this.
And probably a history of some kind of abuse If we don't ask recruiters, we tell them you're.
The answer is always no. Never use drugs either.
Nope, so I can see that. Air Force has a little bit higher standards, and they are a little bit more strict with like waivers.
Yep.
And the Navy's the same way.
Yep.
So,
Air Force and the Navy have the lowest rates. I would probably venture to say that the Space Force is probably winning at this point because there's only like 20 people in it. But the Army and the Marines are the highest for exactly what you just said. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question. With veterans that go to independent medical exams in the VA claims process.
Use the microphone, please.
Yeah, he's got it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Veterans that go to independent medical exams many times are asked, they're there for their medical claim of, say, PTSD. And they will go into the question of, were you abused as a child? And they want to know all about their history as a child. But they may have served 20 or however many years in the military. Is that really fair to that veteran if they're going to that one appointment with that clinician that they've never seen before, but only for an independent medical exam to have them make an assessment or a judgment call that they had some possible sexual trauma or childhood abuse? Is that fair to that veteran?
Let me go get my soapbox. No, it's not. It's not fair because, first of all, did the military let them in?
Yes.
If they let them in, and they were good enough to be in, and they were good enough to fight in the country, and willing to put down their lives for you and me and our freedom, does it matter because they let them in? Shouldn't matter. But does it complicate things? Absolutely. And are they fishing for that? Absolutely. Same thing with like bipolar disorder.
Right.
Like I've heard of people who have been diagnosed erroneously, by the way, like it really wasn't bipolar, but they diagnosed it with bipolar as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's considered a pre-existing condition, and so then they weren't able to get benefits and compensation. But I mean, we could rail the disability and compensation process today, but that's not what I'm here for. But anytime you want a sideline, I'd be happy to talk to you about it after, because there's some ways that you can work around that and massage things. Yes, sir.
I was gonna say, on the flip side from recruiting, where nothing's wrong, you just tell them what you happened in the Army or service, when you do your claims, leave it at that. I'm not promoting anything, just, you gotta work with the system, unfortunately.
So
they're there to basically disallow your claim.
So if, just in case you didn't hear him, his encouragement or recommendation is to focus solely on what occurred during military service and not to discuss much outside of that range. But I will acknowledge that I have some vets that have gone through it, and they do, like, they don't, oh, it says here that you were deployed 6 times. Tell me about your childhood abuse.
Yeah.
That's what I want to hear about.
Yeah.
And it's like a 30-minute examination, and they hyper-focus on the one thing. So does it happen? Absolutely. Is it right? No. Do I get to be in charge? Unfortunately, not yet. Vote for me, 2028. Seems like there was something really profound I was going to add to that slide, and I don't remember what it is. I do apologize. Again, you're my first people that I've ever done this with, so I really appreciate you being here with me today and being so kind. So there is a variation across the military branches. Oh, I'm so sorry, sir.
There was a couple of things that were said, and for one with childhood trauma and also inner cities trauma, one thing that was calculated is the inner city gangs, because there's a lot of violence, a lot of shootings, a lot of everything that they experience on every single day. And though there might be trauma at home, they go to the streets for protection. So that's one thing about childhood trauma. Also, depending upon what part of the United States you come from, there's more trauma. Like I grew up in Alaska, so seeing so anyway,
it's a range, right?
yeah,
It's just
basically
different. It's really bad. It's just different.
Well, see, what's the thing with growing up in Alaska, seeing your friends mauled. Death is common, so that's the other part of childhood trauma that most do not accept. So it's not really abusive, it's nature versus nurture. And the thing is, yeah, with the, so like at young ages and stuff, and also society itself, like Space Naval. So at the age of 6, watching someone jump off of it is.
Yeah, absolutely. At different ages, we're able to handle different levels of intensity or distress, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the like you were showing the bags on the side of the road, I do apologize for the graphic nature. I avoid them, and so the thing that they don't tell you. So we stop at a safe distance. You get out, you kick the bag, making sure nothing. Well, first you make sure no wires, plates, or anything. Then you kick the bag. Then you have the. You hope for an IED because it's a pleasant thing. Because what they do for sympathizers over in.
We got you. You're good.
So anyway, they quarter the sympathizers, and when you open the bag, the body at 140 degrees liquefies. So that's no, you can't get out. Then the other thing too is like pre-existing disabilities on top of trauma that no one takes into account. And also the there's just a lot of things. But one thing society takes, I mean, we get it, thank you, but it's not really heartfelt, because how you do your job, what you go through, and there's little tolerance in the workplace. So there's more trauma sustained when the vet goes from service to the civilian sector. And so anyway, that's a couple things I kind of noticed. But thank you.
As you pointed out, it's super duper complicated, right? And then there's several things that I didn't talk about today that we could absolutely add on to the top of everything that we discussed. We didn't talk about the increased risk of substance abuse when you have TBI and PTSD. And if you have increased use of substances like alcohol, or alcohol's the one I don't like the most, I'll be honest with you, because it causes inflammation in your brain. You already have inflammation in your brain because of TBI. You already have inflammation going on in your body because of your cortisol levels, and then you add alcohol to it. These men and women are driving around in a car on 4 donuts, and all 4 donuts are flat. And we've got to figure out a way to help cohesively and holistically get their body right, their hormones right, the toxic metals out, in order to help them do the heart work. Because if your car isn't running really well, it's really difficult to do this extra like existential cognitive work that needs to be done to reintegrate all of these things that we talked about today. So the best thing that you can do for yourself is focusing on like your health, asking some of these questions of your physicians, getting some of these levels tested if you haven't already had these things tested. Not everybody has the ability to go see the AMEN clinic and get those really fancy scans done, but there are facilities out there. And I know that we're working, I know Washington State DVA, I know the Big Brother VA at times has talked about approaching care for veterans more holistically. Like for those of you that are involved in the VA, obviously all of us are at this point, acupuncture wasn't a thing a few years ago. Remember when chiropractic was voodoo magic? Chiropractic's amazing, and so is acupuncture. But like 5 years ago, like chiropractor wasn't a thing in the VA. They didn't think it was real medicine. It's not real. But now it is. Before the pandemic, they were looking at also including naturopathy. And last time I made the phone call, and it was the fall before COVID hit in 2020, they were working on the contracting the providers and coming up with the formularies and all the things. And then COVID happened. And it's like that whole push never happened. So, but hopefully we'll get there again. Yes, sir.
To comment on that, what the VA and state VAs are doing is what something that was mentioned earlier today from David Fuentes was about the Staff Sergeant Fox grant. That is VA's attempt at using nonprofits and other veteran service organizations to start using and exploring alternative holistic approaches that are evidence-based.
And it's a fantastic program.
Yeah.
They sponsor acupuncture with a specialist type of, she's got a unique certification in our local area. They also sponsor equine therapy in our area. And is there anything else special that
It's Powerful Humans. With Ruben.
Powerful Humans with Ruben. I don't remember Ruben's last name.
Oh, God, I'm forgetting. He's such an amazing guy.
He's a motivational coach.
Yeah, he was the guest speaker last year at Serving Those Who Serve, the keynote speaker, and an amazing human being. So we have under Sergeant Fox Grant, he builds resilience and works with veterans and their bodies and does that. So we have three what they call alternative approaches under Sergeant Fox Grant, and those kind of grants really pave the way for the future. I mean, they really do. They take that information and we learn a lot from that.
And a handful of us cornered Keith about some other brilliant ideas that we have to include naturopathy and some other stuff today. I'm like, can we make this happen? He's like, so he's working on it, and we're going to continue to expand those services. Yes, ma'am.
So we work with the Spokane Veterans Therapeutic Court, Veterans Court, and Spokane Veterans Forum is our nonprofit organization. It's the educational component. We started doing sailing, therapeutic sailing in Idaho, Dog Smile Adventure, and I know that there's a couple of groups here. One of them is an attorney Marine that has started a program that's racing with national sailboats. So that is besides the equine sailing, and it's amazing. You get out on the water and you have someone that knows what they're doing, and it's peaceful.
The other thing that we've done in Wenatchee, and this isn't through like my clinic and it's not reimbursed, but if you guys have a wild hair up your tail, this is a fabulous way to help guys reintegrate too, is we started a men's softball team because it was men's softball season. And everybody's a vet that's on our team. Nobody else in the league has a team made up of vets. And first of all, the amount of injuries that we've had has been outstanding. Up until the very last week of the season, every single injury went to what branch? Marines. And then my husband broke his foot, and then the Army got pulled into the mix. But what happens is, have you guys heard of battle mind, where you're like trying to transition the military mindset into the civilian mindset to where it is not hypervigilance in a negative context, it's situationally aware. That sounds much better, right? So, and we had a CSM that just recently retired, and he lost his mind on the field. I mean, he's just fresh out of the Army. I think he discharged in December, February, and then he was playing with us in April, and he like rage quit. And then he come up to me after the softball game, he's like, I don't know if I should be playing with you guys because I don't want to ruin all your fun. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I'm getting really angry and really worked up. I'm like, everybody's got issues here. And we still love you. And that's the cool thing about it. They can absolutely lose their minds within reason. We've only had one guy ejected from the game, and he had to pay $20, and he hasn't done it since. That's a win. He's a Marine too. But you can lose your mind, we're there to be stable, check you, and then you come back and we try again. Like, things like that can be such a good support tool as well. And I think did you have something that you wanted to say?
Krista, I'm a nurse at the VA, and I appreciate what you said about, we call it whole health. So yes, absolutely. We cover acupuncture, massage, chiropractic, meditation, tai chi, aromatherapy, alpha stim, yoga. All of those things are part of the basic benefit now. It's available in all of the contract providers in Washington. I don't know specifically, but if we don't, we can, or we should, or we offer it. I mean, you can get acupuncture from nurses at each spot or facility, but absolutely the VA as a whole health is in the top 10 priorities, and it's to address exactly what you're talking about, the whole person. It's not just about pills and therapy and things like that. Who are you as a person? What are your goals, and how can we meet them holistically? So we're there going
walking down the line, which is good. Yes, sir.
I think there's still something that is a perfect audience who sounds like a lot of counselors. Yes, there's a lot of possible alternative therapies, but unless you're a counselor with 3 years, the VA and TRICARE won't cover you. If you're an equine therapist, but you don't have a master's degree and a certified counselor, it won't cover it. It's then called equine learning. So if we're in a crisis of helping PTSD and suicide, why are we still allowing these old methods of discounting 30% of our workforce? And Keith and I have talked about this a little bit.
Have you talked to Keith?
Yeah, he did.
Awesome. Awesome. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Dan.
I want to answer that. To an extent, yes. However, there's a changing shift. Peer support is on the rise as long as the service provided is evidence-based practices. Right? So as long as it's evidence-based and
Evidence-based means that there has been longitudinal or long-term studies with pre-test and post-test that show that there's documented improvement over time. That's super simplified, but that's what evidence-based practices are.
I appreciate that because I can do that.
That's probably.
But there is a shift there because, like, yes, the norm is a licensed clinical psychiatrist or mental health provider through, CBT, EMDR. But on the alternative holistic approaches, as long as it's evidence-based, and I'm using veteran rights, I don't know if anyone here has ever heard of it, they use outdoor therapeutics in the wilderness for 2 weeks. Not a single licensed clinical psychiatrist there, but because it's evidence-based, it's actually able to be funded by the VA.
The VA funds it.
Yeah. At least they refer people for fun. Let me see. The VA has referred people to veterans' rights and paid for any associated fees related to the treatment.
Which is founded on an evidence-based model of some sort. My hamster's going. I'm coming up with all sorts of ideas.
So the military VA system, I'll just say VA system uses, from my experience, hydrocodone, oxycodone, and all of the other pills. In their spaces and what you've shown today, do you know of any studies done by the VA that they're using or incorporated legal, because it is here in Washington, CBD or any of those aspects that would help the veterans with PTSD?
So the problem is, it's complicated, right? So, just like the training. So what happens is we have state laws and we have federal laws. It's a federal program. So what struggles, and this is not the VA's fault, the government moves marijuana, for example, under a class that you can't study the way that you can study other drugs and things of that nature. So we're trying to figure out how, so it really takes an act of Congress, which is scary in its own right, so you can move the classification of the drugs and then you can study it and they can be, so if you have a drug that isn't considered therapeutic, you can't study it. So it's trying to get lost into different classes and all that. So what we need is to move certain what was considered drugs. You know, we all have antidepressants are drugs, caffeine's a drug, nicotine's a drug, you know, all those kind of, into a classification that we can study it. Then on a federal level, then you can make policies that make sense. So I hope that, I didn't want to get lost in all that. So I hope that made sense to everyone. And I'm going to give it better to somebody who's doing a lot better with a microphone right now than I am. So here you go.
Yes, sir.
I might as well use it. I'm gonna get a military voice, but I don't want to scare people.
I'm just kidding. One of my colleagues over at YBC in Yakima, he was letting me know that they were utilizing some CBD stuff, marijuana, while he was going under hypnosis to help him be able to sleep better. And he was sharing that with me, so, I mean, I do believe him, and I wasn't gonna try it, but he was telling me that it was working for him. So there is that, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's the thing, right? In the state of Washington, if you're over the age of 21, there's plenty of dispensaries.
Oh, everywhere.
They're everywhere. And you, I mean, if you have questions, like finding a dispensary with a decent person working behind the counter, isn't that actually that difficult? They're actually pretty knowledgeable. So if you have questions about that, and like if you're after sleep, if you're after inflammation, if you're after, like, talk to the people who work in the marijuana shops. They're the ones that know the best. But also be aware that the whole like anxiety thing in marijuana, that's real. And also the whole like, you smoke a certain strain of marijuana and then you eat your whole refrigerator, that's absolutely real. So be careful. But you know what doesn't come along with marijuana? Did you say chips? Awesome. Domestic violence charges. Does that come along with alcohol? I'm just saying, it's just an observation. Yes, sir.
Really quick is, I don't know if most people are aware, I don't know if they have currently, but they're in the process, they're actually moving it from class 1 to class 3, which still technically is illegal, but it's not on the same classification as like fentanyl, heroin, and everything like that. So, like that gentleman was saying, if it goes down to that class, are they able to start studying it then?
That's correct. That's why it sounds so, if you move it from a Schedule 1, then you can do the research, and once you do the research, then the government and federal things can make policies that make sense. Yeah,
They said
instead.
they either have moved it or they're about to. The DEA is actually, federal government's
Yeah.
reclassifying to.
If they do,
Class 3.
when that becomes official, then the research can follow, and then sane policies can begin. Yeah.
Alrighty, my friends, we are at 1:15, and I want to be respectful of your time and your ability to do what you need to do before your next event. But I will be up here packing up. If you have any other questions or want to pick my brain, you're more than welcome.
QR code at the end. Isn't there another? Is there a QR code that was added?
Oh, look, there's so many more slides.
Jackpot. So do you mind if I?
Yeah. So, just a quick thing, if you're looking for continuing education, also we always like your feedback, because just a quick camera, it'll have all the information you need. You'll be able to get everything we can hear from you. You can also get continuing education. And the last but not least thing, can we give a huge hand of applause to Heather Hill? Thank you so much. You guys are awesome. Just so you know, when you talk, it just adds everything to it. So, you know, when you do breakouts and your point of view, you're valuable and your point of view really matters. So take good care. Remember, we'll have some